Mocto. Gracias. Thank you, Miguel, and all the organizers for inviting us to the 7th Annual Soil Not Oil Conference. My name is Devon Peña. I'm a professor at the University of Washington, and I'm also the founder and president of the Acequia Institute.
Muy buenos días from San Luis, Colorado. My name is Shirley Romero Otero. I am a 30-year veteran teacher. I've taught mostly high school ethnic studies and worked with marginalized students. I am currently the president of the Land Rights Council and another nonprofit organization known as the Move Mountains Youth Project. I'm the executive director of that particular program, and also a very recent member to the Acequia Institute. Thank you for the invitation to be with you this morning.
Today, we're going to share with you the work we've been doing to rebuild our institutions of collective action. The Acequias, which are the water democracies that exist throughout northern New Mexico, southern Colorado, and actually other parts of the Southwest as well. Our land grant association, the Ejido, Common Lands, is also an institution of collective action. And of course, our tradition of mutual aid societies, like the SPM-DTU, Sociedad Protectora Mutualista de Trabajadores Unidos, has a history here, and we are working to revive that tradition as well. A lot of people don't know where we are. We're sort of one of those off the grid, off the map places. The Acequias de la Sierra Culebra is part of the Sangre de Cristo mountain range that runs from the northern part of our San Luis Valley. The valley is about 100 miles long and about 60, 70 miles wide at its widest. And on the eastern side of our valley is the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The indigenous Nuche, Ute people called them the Shining Mountains. We are in fact here in the ancestral territories of the Nuche, the Diné, the Tiwa, Apache, and other ancestral peoples' territories. There are in fact 48 different indigenous nations that claim Colorado as a home place. We're also on a very unusual piece of land known as the Merced de Sangre de Cristo. This is an 1843 Mexican land grant. Therefore, it's also ancestral territory for Chicaneques people. I would point out that 1/3 of our population here are descendants of Genizaros, that is, of Native American slaves who eventually intermarried with the families. We are an indigenous people, and we tend to, if you look at this t-shirt, to survive the borderlands, you must live sin fronteras, be a crossroads. And that's really the story of our community, which is a very Mexican origin community. It's also surrounded by a lot of sacred landscapes. This is Cisnagini, Black Belted Mountain, sacred mountain of the Navajo, of the Diné people. There are all kinds of stories about this beautiful mountain that rises above 14,000, like all the mountains around us do, basically. And here in the Upper Rio Grande, there are stories of creation. And the Diné people, of course, know that changing woman or white shell woman inhabits Cisnagini. She's very important because she gave birth to the monster slayer and the water giver that made the fourth world safe for the Diné people to emerge and co-inhabit this beautiful part of Abiyala, Turtle Island. Our watershed encompasses 80,000 acres of uplands and about 33,000 to 43,000 acres of bottomlands. We have 1 peak over 14 and 8 over 13, and that's where our water for irrigation, for our water democracy comes from, the high mountain peak snow melt. We have the oldest adjudicated water rights in the state of Colorado. For example, on the San Luis People's Ditch down here, which is what we irrigate with, that's a decree from 1852. Here's another perspective, Geostat perspective. You're looking south towards the Taos Plateau. Right here, you see Ute Mountain and San Antonio. That's right on the border with New Mexico. So we really are culturally, politically, in terms of genealogy, an extension of the indigenous peoples of northern part of the institutions of self-government that we have been reviving under a new law that we got passed in 2009, the Colorado Acequia Recognition Law. For those of you familiar with Western water law, prior appropriation, how it dominates everything west of the 100th meridian. We're prior to prior, and that's what the state of Colorado has finally recognized, allowing us to abide by our own customary law and practice, like one irrigator, one vote, instead of mutual ditch company share voting. We also share scarcity versus the imposition of priority calls. We have required communal labor, where we cooperate to maintain and operate the acequias. And we also don't view water as a commodity, which is very different from prior appropriation. It is an asset in place. It has cultural, ecological, religious, and spiritual value. And so we're also very different in our cultural landscapes. We have these long vara strips rather than the square grits of the land ordinance of 1785. We don't follow the square grit topography. There's a very unique approach, meets and bounds, rather than square grit range, township, range, section, subsection kind of cultural landscape. And this creates very interesting linear villages. By the way, I'm a myth buster. I do a lot of research on the origin of these systems. And the myth is that these long lots come from Spain and Roman practice. That's simply not true. The Visigoths invaded what is now Spain in 3 times. And the 5th century invasion, they converted to Catholicism and introduced the riparian long lot. They call it the Waldhoffendorf. And here's an example of one from Königswald in Saxony, Germany. That's where the long lot comes from. And when the Visigoths invaded Spain, they introduced the long lot, and somehow they ended up over here in San Luis, Colorado. So it's a fascinating genesis of a tradition we have here that melds together agricultural and cultural landscape ecologies from 3 different continents: Africa, Eurasia, and the Americas, with very little actually coming from Spain. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague because you need to understand the land right struggle.
So I was born and raised in this community, and went away for about a 30-year period to have a career in teaching, and I've been back in the community. But I want to tell you briefly the struggle for the common lands that is part of the Sangre de Cristo land grant. The Sangre de Cristo land grant is a Mexican land grant, and it's a community land grant. There's 2 types of land grants. So there are Spanish land grants that were awarded when Mexico was under the auspices of Spain. And then there were land grants that were given when Mexico got back control from Spain. And then they're either community land grants or they're private land grants. I am an heir to a Mexican community land grant known as the Sangre de Cristo land grant. And it was the largest land grant ever awarded to the Chicano community. I am Mexican, of course, but I strongly identify as Chicana because of how I was raised and the era in which I was raised. So we are talking about the Sangre de Cristo land grant is 1.2 million acres. And it is now divided into thirds. I'm going to talk about what sits in the middle, because our land grant extends into New Mexico. So I'm talking about roughly 80,000 acres of, you'll see pictures of that, known as La Sierra, which translates into the mountain. So prior to around the mid 1800s to that, the early 1800s, there were, of course, indigenous folks, indigenous nations living here. My indigenous legacy comes from, I am Jacaria Apache. So my pueblo is the Picurillos Pueblo, just a few miles south of where I sit today. So from the 1800s to 1960, this land grant, these 80,000 acres, which really is a mountain, and then the villages sit on the bottom. Always keeping in mind that our main watersheds come out of those mountains. The water that we survive on today comes out of those mountains. So we always say here, water is life. Mini Wiconi, water is life. Without those watersheds, without the access to that mountain, these communities would not exist. Up until 1960, when I was 5 years old, it was used communally. It was used communally to hunt, fish, for recreation, for grazing, for picking our medicinal herbs. Everything we needed was on that mountain. Up until 1960, that's how it was used. In 1960, a rich lumberman from North Carolina known as Jack Taylor, who is a descendant of President Zachary Taylor, who was a major player in the Mexican-US war. He was a descendant of that. He flew over, he flew over this area in 1960, put it in perspective. And pardon my language, but I'm going to quote him exactly how they quoted him in the New Yorker magazine. He flew over here, over the area, and he said, I can't believe that these fucking Mexicans have all of this property, all of this land, all of this forest, and they're not doing anything with it. What he meant was we weren't cutting down the trees, we weren't timbering, and we weren't polluting our streams. So from 1960 to 1980, he was able to, just like Manifest Destiny, acquire as much land as you can from the east to the west. This was still part of that theology that was taking place, but now it was in our backyard. He was able to quiet title that property, notify only 12% of the people that were going to be impacted, when we know now that he could have identified everyone that was going to be impacted, but he chose not to do that. All of the proceedings were done in Denver. With all the research we've done on the latest case that I will talk about, we now know that the judges were in his pocket, the surveyor generals were in his pocket, anyone that had any power to give that, to sell that land over to him, it was sold to him. Long story short, he ended up buying it by having all the procedures in the legal procedures done in Denver. And many of our people, putting it in perspective, in 1960, did not travel 4 hours, didn't know that this was happening. Most folks around here, my ancestors, my grandparents, had an 8th grade education and spoke primarily Spanish. So from 1960 to 1965, legal proceedings took place. By 1965, he was awarded title to that property. He started fencing people up. There are 9 gates now, and he put up a fence which didn't exist. And most people that own lots of land in this community, we are the poorest county in the state of Colorado, but we are rich in culture and tradition and land ownership. Most people had to move away into the cities. They went north to Pueblo, Colorado Springs, Denver. They went south to Albuquerque and Phoenix. They traveled to California. They didn't leave their lands, but they somewhat abandoned their properties without selling them. And that really changed the face of this community. People left, population, the Vietnam War came in. It really devastated our community looking back. Now you move up to from 1965 to 1977. What had transpired in that year was the civil rights movement, the Chicano movements, of which I proudly am a product of. And we gained our education. We understood what our true history was and what the true history of the founding of this country was. So we were educated. There were struggles taking place in which we participated. In 1977, my then husband, Ray Otero, who was a Vietnam veteran and a very strong organizer across the Southwest, was asked by the elders who put a struggle in the early 1960s to come back and somehow take this case back to court. For 4 years, we organized the Land Rights Council, of which I am one of the co-founders and the current president. We organized the Land Rights Council. We did research. We traveled to Spain, to Puerto Rico, to Taos, New Mexico, all over where we could find documents. Now, prior to that, we had the land grab movement, that Reyes Lopez Tijerina in New Mexico, who we consider the godfather of the land grab movement, had already had some advances in New Mexico. That helped us. So for 4 years, we did the research and we found out what the elders already knew, that this land was stolen, it should have never been sold, and that our rights were definitely violated, our rights to access that property, and they were also violated under the due process clause. We never had an opportunity in those Denver hearings in the early 60s to make our case. So we organized 118 individuals, heirs, that would stand in the place of their relatives that should have been in court in the early 60s. And we filed a class action lawsuit known as Rael versus Taylor on March the 8th, 1981. So prior to that, you had the creation of the Association por Derechos Civiles. These were individuals, the prior generations, who did what they could with the resources that they had. Our generation had more resources. we could do the research. We knew where to get the research. We did the research, but we were also able to convince attorneys from the groups out of Denver that would actually take this case. So in March the 8th, 1981, we were able to file a class action lawsuit known as Rael versus Taylor. Rael for the godfather of the land grant movement in my community. A lot of what I've learned, he was a mentor to me. Then when he died, it put in a new defendant, a new plaintiff, and that is now Rael, Lovato versus Taylor. So from 1981 to 2002, this lawsuit went before a variety of courts, the Court of Appeals, the Colorado Supreme Court. It went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. It was in the courts. It's the longest court case, land grant case that has ever been filed. It's the longest court case ever filed in the state of Colorado because it's been in the courts for so long. So in 2002, in June, filed in 1981, in 2002, we got a partial victory where we were allowed to go back and gain access to graze, to gather firewood and timber. We didn't get some of the other rights that I had mentioned, so it's a partial victory. Then it took 14 years for a title company in Alamosa, Colorado, here in the Valley, to identify who was going to have access. Today, there are over 1,000 individuals who have keys to those 9 gates that could go in and utilize their rights. So we are on the second chapter of this case because it has changed owners 4 times. It's been owned by Jack Taylor. Then it was owned by Lu Pai, who was the Chinese chemist with Enron, who made more money out of the fall and the scandal of Enron and got away with it than any of the other players. And then it was sold to oil and gas people out of Glenwood, Texas, the Welches and I don't remember the other folks. And then now it's in the current hands of a 40-year multi-billionaire from San Antonio, Texas. His name is William Harrison. So the next chapter continues to be able to fully utilize our access rights with some barriers that they try to put in place, but we're dealing with that. Our case did 2 things, and I will end with this. Our case did 2 things. It set legal precedents in 2 ways. Even though a private owner may own that, our rights will always trump his. He cannot do any development or any building or anything or grazing that's going to impact our grazing rights, our rights to gather firewood and lumber. And the other thing is those rights have been set in stone. So my 4 daughters, my 2 grandsons, and the folks that come in the next generations, their rights will be set in stone, and those rights go along with the property. If they own property, then they have access to that land. Many more details to this, but this was important to tell because it's important for the rest of the story that we're going to tell, how the mountain connects with the lowlands and our acequia practices.
Thank you, Shirley. A couple of notes about this that I would add. The rights to this common land were patented by Congress in the 1860s. And that's why the sequence of billionaire owners, absentee landowners, have not been able to dislodge us. We're like La Garrapata Mexicana, right? The Mexican tick. They can't get us out of here. What that mountain supports is Acequia Farms, an amazing set of 23,000 acres of irrigated farmland using ancient flood irrigation methods that actually bring soil down from the cirques up in the mountains, mineral-rich replenishing of our soils. This is part of our regenerative practice. It's really important to understand the art and science of acequia flood irrigated practice. It's not easy to become an artisan at acequia irrigation. A lot of people will suffer erosion because they don't know how to control water. But it is actually the incomplete control of water that makes us famous, because that incomplete control of water provides a lot of ecosystem services. We're known around the world by academic researchers and scientists for providing, just in our 7-county region of the Upper Rio Grande in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado, in excess of about $500 million in annual economic base and ecosystem services like riparian corridors, which nurture wildlife habitat and movement corridors. We have medicinal plants that grow along these riparian corridors, along the earthenwork ditches. In a word, basically what the Acequia does is to extend the biodiversity hotspot of the Southwest, which is the riparian strip. We create more riparian strips beyond the creeks. And this is a very important part of the Acequia institution, is that we're providers. We make possible tourism and all the other economic life that happens around us. We also have a collective institution of cooperation and mutual aid. This extends to the annual spring ditch cleanup, what we call La Saca y Limpieza de Acequia. Here's our annual meeting a few years back when we were getting ready to clean the San Luis Peoples Ditch, which is only one of two of our acequias that have been cement lined. It's a complicated history. It happened during LBJ's rural poverty, war on poverty, and we don't have time to go into it, but we prefer the earthenwork ditches because when we cement lined the San Luis Peoples Acequia, we destroyed the riparian habitat. Would you like to talk about the other side of this, that while the land rights struggle was going on, all of a sudden, right before Seattle's WTO wipeout struggles, we had activists here who joined the local ranchers and farmers in resisting logging, industrial scale logging of the common lands. And you see these puppets in Seattle. This was in 1995. They came here first, I think, before they went off to the WTO and introduced the tradition of the Spanish giant puppets as protest icons. But would you like to say anything about this? Shirley?
So when it was under the ownership of Taylor, there was the logging that was being done, and that was destroying not only the watersheds, but the way the snow melts and the way the water comes down, so that we don't run out of water early on when we're growing our gardens and in the middle of needing water. And we partnered with the white environmentalist group that came in, specifically Ancient Forest Rescue, because they were the ones that came in and stayed. And they took a step back and they realized that there was more than just a struggle to stop the logging, that there was this whole other lawsuit that was being, that was in the courts, and that needed support. So what came out of that was a relationship that still exists today with many of those members. And they, together with our local activists, were able to stop that logging. And that took place when Lou Pai took ownership. His wife, who many of us never met, saw that was destructive and convinced her husband, then the owner, to stop the logging. So it was a relationship that started that had never happened here in San Luis. Like I said, some of those people still come back whenever we need support in whatever we're doing environmentally here. So the partnership worked, it stopped the logging, and it created this working relationship among groups of different ethnicities.
Yeah, and the New York Times characterized this as the hottest environmental dispute in the Rockies. And it was a very unusual case. They called it the real Milagro Beanfield War, but it did bring radical environmentalists from Earth First, Greenpeace, Ancient Forest Rescue, and so on, together with the ranchers and farmers of our community, of our Acequia Hut. And of course, you'll notice here, without water, there's no life. There's a little fish-like blue sign that one of the local youth is holding, anticipating Standing Rock. The other thing that's very important about why we want to protect acequias and why this is interwoven with the watershed protection philosophy that we have is we are a center of origin diversification of Zea maize, also Phaseolus vulgaris, specifically Bolita beans. We're at 8,000 feet above sea level. We're pushing the limits of what's possible with agriculture so that, for example, our maíz de concho is adapted to high elevation conditions. It's a short season variety that Bayer Monsanto would love to get a hold of. They've tried. It matures in 74 to 80 days because we have a very short growing season at our elevation and surrounded by 14,000 foot high mountains on both sides. So Zea maize Clebenus culebrana, we use it to make pozol, which is the nixtamalized version of corn, which is, I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. And we also make chicos del horno, as you will see in a moment. I believe I may have a photo here pretty soon. And we also are now going to make non-GMO, organic, heirloom corn tortillas. We just acquired 2 volcanic rock mills that I'm going to talk about in a moment. We have, in other words, what I like to call deep seeds and deep foods, not just slow and local, but deep embedded in place. A scientist from, a corn scientist from Colorado College by the name of Dr. Ralph Bertrand did a study of our corn, which was gifted to me by Corpus Gallegos in 1988. And this white flint was found to have shared genome sequences with maize cobs found both at Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. So we know that the germplasm here is really ancient, thousands of years old. What you see here on the left-hand side, this pops up in our fields every now and then in our milpas. And I was like, well, what is that? And people here, some folks call it maíz de trenza, braided corn. And it's actually a tunicate form that George Beadle received the Nobel Prize when he did the piece in 1980 on the ancestry of corn. What's happening here is that our corn is trying to revert back to being wild. This only happens in inbred parent lines that are land races. It doesn't happen to hybrid commercial corn, and it doesn't happen to GMO events either. You have to have a corn whose genome is so ancient that it still wants to go back to being wild every now and then. You can see here the corn's becoming grass-like again, and this part here looks a lot like teocintle. So it wants to go back to being teocintle. And up here you have some of my chimeras of land races that I've mixed. I've been collecting Zea mays for about 38 years now, and have a collection from all over Abya Yala and Turtle Island. Not all of it grows here, by the way, I've tried. It's hard to grow, for example, Oaxacan green dent, but Oaxacan green dent characteristics did cross-pollinate with our maíz de concha to produce these amazing patterns alongside Zuni red and black Aztec and some others. Here's 3 generations working the annual horneada. This is where we use adobe ovens, wood ash and water to nixtamalize the corn and make chicos del horno, as we call them. And so when we think about regenerative agriculture, you know, these guys with the center pivots, they claim to be regenerative. No-till. Hey, no-till is an ideology of a white settler colonial mindset. That's the first thing you're going to have to understand. What really works is the old milpa long duration rotation island, which is the practice that most of us here follow. I'll describe that if I get a chance later on, but we need to make a choice. Even among those who claim to be regenerative agriculture folks, the polka dot uniformity of the center pivot sprinkler operations that are north of us and west of us, and the biocultural messy diversity, as I like to call it, of our milpas, our polyculture corn gardens, and our home kitchen gardens, the huerto familiar. This photo is of obviously calabacita, surrounded with some corn and some bolita beans, and a lot of so-called weeds that we don't consider weeds. Weeds are useful biomass. Purslane helps maintain moisture, it suppresses other weeds, and it's a superfood, anti-inflammatory properties, high vitamin content. Why would you want to get rid of verdolagas, as we call them? It's a survivor food, and it's a food that helps add biodynamic processes to the soil and to the rhizosphere, the root zone. So we're very happy to welcome weeds like purslane and lamb's quarters, both of which are very important foods for us during the long winter that we have here. So part of the work we're doing too is to restore our heritage cuisines. We want to restore our heritage agroecosystems, but we also want to restore our heritage cuisines because of all the epigenetic factors, there's nothing more important than diet probably, other than maybe pollution, toxicity. So we're very interested in also tying our heritage cuisine to our ethnic and indigenous identity. And this also in some ways highlights our soil biodynamic practices, all of which are older than Rudolf Steiner's work in the 1920s. But he couldn't have known about our indigenous soil biodynamic practices of companion planting, intercropping, polycultures, adding tinctures, adding rotten wood, all these different practices that anticipate by thousands of years what became known as biodynamics and permaculture, which are often presumed to be inventions of white settler colonial folks, and they're not. This is part of the racial inequity that is built into the sustainable ag movement as a whole. We also, of course, in producing chicos, we also make bolita beans and we combine them, making a beautiful corn and bean soup We prepare these in adobe ovens. The water is mixed with wood ash, so the corn is nixtamalized. That's very important for those of you who are unfamiliar with nixtamalization. It's a process invented thousands of years ago by indigenous farmers in what is now Mexico and Central America. And basically the use of wood ash, which is basically the same as slaked lime or cal, calcium hydroxide, will strip the corn kernel of the pericarp, which makes available to human digestion all the B vitamin series, the amino acids, and other anti-inflammatory phytochemicals that are in corn. If you don't do this, and settler colonists did not, when they took the corn back to Europe, they didn't nixtamalize it, well, you're getting empty calories, sugar and carb. You know, you've got to unlock the secrets of corn's nutrition. If you want to read more about this, this is an active link. I imagine that the colleagues here at the conference are going to keep a copy of this, but maybe I can show you right now. There it is, coming in. So that's an active link for those of you in charge of the conference. You can look at it by when they upload the PowerPoint. So continuing, the project that we're involved in is a partnership between the Move Mountains Youth Project and the Acequia Institute. This is a photo of the Culebra River at Almunia, which is a agricultural research extension and farm school. We created this because the NRCS, USDA does not serve as well. So we're filling in the gap. A lot of our colleagues are local experts like Maestra Teresa Vigil, who's Chicana and from San Felipe Pueblo. And she's one of our elders, one of our mentors and field instructors. We've been teaching with her for quite a long time with local youth and students from all manner of universities, including this group of students from the University of Washington who came here a couple of years back. And these are all local youth, some of them still working with us this morning in the field. I think some of those folks were here today. This is my UW group. We've been building adobe ovens since that late 1980s when I was at Colorado College. And this is used every year to produce chicos and other good things. This is a photo of Isaiah Sanchez during last year's Chicos Making Harvest. And Isaiah, I just want to note, his late mother, was tribally enrolled with the Arapaho Nation, also had ties to Kiowa and Lakota peoples. And his father is Chicano. And so now Isaiah is being raised by his grandma, his Mexican origin grandma here in San Luis. And it's a perfect illustration of how our indigenous ties run very wide and deep. We're going to now shift to the main part of our presentation, which is about what we're trying to do to solve some problems that we have with the collapse of our common lands access. This had a dramatic impact on us. This is the challenge in brief. While we are rich in land, water, seed, traditional knowledge, and all the rest, we have the highest rates of obesity and diabetes in Colorado. 25% of the population is obese, while 41% is overweight. This is all more than twice the statewide rates. And therefore, it's not surprising that we have a very high rate of diabetes as well, approaching 14% already. This was 2017 data, and I'm told that we're over 14%. And this is a real crisis for us. As I said earlier, among all epigenetic factors, diet is probably the most important thing. And that's what was lost here. The evidence suggests that all these community health problems, the loss of our well-being, is a casualty of the enclosure of the common lands from 1960 to 2002, as you just learned from Shirley's presentation. The dramatic long duration effects of this included the destruction of our food sovereignty and our healthier heritage foodways. We have become, unfortunately, especially since after the Vietnam War, an alfalfa monoculture beef export colony. The enclosure of the common lands led to a shift in the structure of the economy, where we shifted from a very diverse polyculture, subsistence, and local regional market economy based on corn beans, squash, fava beans, and all the rest, but also sheep, goats, dairy cows. And then we became, because of lack of access to the common lands, an export-oriented alfalfa and beef monoculture that produced cash, so that people could go to the grocery store or now to Family Dollar to eat slow death. This has become a very serious problem, and that's what our project is trying to address, is to take us back to traditional agroecosystems. We want to build a solidarity economy, and so Shirley's going to talk about some of the principles that are guiding our work in this regard.
As I still teach in the local school, so I have access to the youth, and that's why Move Mountains was created. There was a lack of positive curriculum development and programming for kids in this community, something that was culturally relevant, that would keep young people not only employed, but engaged in really finding out who their true identity is. I feel very strong that cultural identity is very empowering to young people. And that's how I teach. That's how I work with these kids. That's how I raised my 4 daughters and my 2 grandchildren. So the project that is a pilot project that is reviving and strengthening our local agricultural food system, rekindling our polyculture and ecosystem traditions and heritage cuisines, and I'll talk a little bit about each one of them. Growing community food sovereignty and security, supporting creativity and commitment of our younger generations to remain living and investing in these villages. Co-creating and participating in interwoven local institutions of collective action. The Acequias, the revolving credit Peña is going to talk about, and the initiatives to generate agricultural based wealth and keep it in the community. So what we're doing this summer is the land rights, the Move Mountains Youth Project and the Acequia Institute have partnered with 5 farmers in the community, 5 or 6 farmers that have dedicated some of those fields where they grow alfalfa to growing food, anywhere from a 1/4 acre, a 1/2 acre, or a full acre. So they've dedicated those portions to growing food. Our young people started back in April by cleaning the ditches with the limpieza de las acequias. We cleaned the ditches for the farmers. Then they planted the seeds, and now they're in the fields as we speak today. They are in the fields pulling weeds, hoeing, making sure, and we're ready next week to actually start gathering the produce. I also run the local food bank in the community. So yesterday we received 150 pounds of local vegetables that were grown in one of the farms. So we are growing all of that food. Addie, who couldn't be with us, Addie Lucero, who couldn't be with us on this panel presentation, we're looking to her to guide us on the cuisine part. She will teach us the nutritions. We will be cooking their foods. We've got all kinds of plans for next year and as to what we've learned from this year. But the important thing is that we are able to teach these traditions to the young generation, 18 and under, because they were lost when we lost connection with our land grant, with our sierras. So we're not only teaching them those, they're paid internships where those young people are this summer getting $15 an hour, thanks to the partnership with the Acequia Institute that was able to provide those funds through grants. And we're working on grants for the next growing season as we speak. But what it does from an educator's perspective is that it ties those kids together with traditions that have been lost, and they're learning them together. It brings the farmer, who's usually an elder, and those young people together. Very important for that to happen in this community, because that wisdom is being lost from one generation to another. And we're producing food, and they're able to see that we can grow so much of our food. We were a bread basket at one time. Now that culture has gone to the corporations, and like Mr. Peña said, to growing alfalfa to feed their animals. So kids are realizing that they can grow food and that it doesn't all come from the corporate stores like Safeway, because here you got to go 40 miles in any direction to get a good fresh banana or get good fresh fruits and vegetables, because we don't have it at our local grocer. So kids are understanding this and they're excited about it. And of course, the $15 is an incentive, most definitely. But I'm a true believer that young people should be paid for their labor. They're providing this labor and they're out in the hot sun and it's not easy. So they're learning work ethic skills that we hope to be able to tie to credit through our school district system. So it's been a success. We're halfway through the project. Kids are learning a lot and more than just growing food. And it's just a good way to pass down those traditions, but more importantly, to keep kids off the street and off their the screens and actually out there doing physical work, which encompasses the bigger umbrella of keeping our kids healthy.
I'm not sure if you all are seeing our PowerPoint anymore. Can you all see our PowerPoint?
Yes.
Oh, you can. Okay, good.
Yeah, we see everything. Thank you so much.
Muy bueno. So Shirley's been talking about this Milpasolino Collaborative, and we've got this pilot project. We're cultivating at 6 different farms with about a total of 7 acres, maybe more. It might be more than that. And part of the effort is to provide the farmers with more support than they usually have. So we're willing to come in and do the field prep. We're willing to help with the labor through the Move Mountains project. And then we're paying each of the farmers $2,000 per acre of corn and food delivered to us without like a set amount. The point is to build trust and relationality. And so one of the important components of this is that we want to make non-GMO organic heirloom corn tortillas with our volcanic rock corn grinders. There's no one else doing that here in the Valley, and there's only 2 other people in the state of Colorado, both farm-to-table operations in Denver, that have volcanic rock corn mills. It's tough to operate them. It takes a lot of skill. It's very easy to overheat the rock and have little grains of the rock go into the masarina, which would ruin the whole batch. And that's why people don't use volcanic rock. But I have a taste memory of what a good tortilla, being Mexicano, growing up on the US-Mexico border in Laredo, Texas. I know exactly what a good tortilla tastes like, and traveling all over Mexico, what it's supposed to taste like. We're working a very interesting part of this, however, and it's tied to our acquisition of the R&R market, which was founded in 1857. It's the oldest continuously operated business in Colorado. It's for sale, and the owners want to sell it to us, so we would convert it into a cooperative grocery, full service grocery with USDA certified kitchen, with a workspace for projects that the youth and young adults can bring to the community, whether it's furniture making or making healthy jams and jellies from the native choke cherry and elderberry, gooseberry, currant, all the different fruits that exist here naturally as part of the landscape ecology of the place. But the other thing we're trying to do is we're negotiating with natural grocers to develop double branding. And our corn tortillas, in other words, would go to natural grocers, consumers, with the knowledge that they're going to pay a $3 premium on those tortillas, so that the working class on the west side of Denver, that's Mexican and Latinx and so on, can afford to have the same product under a different brand and access them through their mercados, rather than they don't shop at natural grocers or anything like that. And we're getting a lot of support and interest in this idea, since it's done for a lot of other commodities, coffee foremost among them, but a lot of other products that are already being offered that way, where you pay a premium so that other people can have access. This is part of our food justice work. Now, in acquiring the R&R market, we're going to have to remake it as a space for performance, for youth gatherings, for production. That's where a Masarina Molino operation will be located. And the nice thing about this project is that the second floor has 6 apartments. We will become landlords, but it'll generate $40,000 a year in rental revenue that will go into, that will go into our mutual aid society. I'm working on creating an endowment and a perpetual purpose trust that will finance the Revolving Credit Association. This is part of our tradition. We've been, like other BIPOC communities, victims of the violence of financial capitalism for 7 or 8 generations, if not longer, in this community. What that means, basically, is we've lacked access to capital and credit markets. We've lacked access to NRCS and USDA funding as well. So what we're trying to correct is to go back to our own institutions of collective action, like the Mutual Aid Society, so that through the Perpetual Purpose Trust, we could do a revolving credit association for local youth and young adults. We would provide 0% interest loans for anything that's related to keeping agricultural wealth in the community, as well as anything else related to community health, because housing is a big issue. We have all these young people in their 20s who need support to get certified as plumbers, electricians, carpenters, drywall, all of it. We're going to do that for them. We're going to get them to create a company so that they can start working with local low-income families to upgrade their housing. And that will improve community health as well. 0% interest involving credit funds, but also we're working on a formula where once a person who borrows money pays half of the loan on time, we will pay the second half. We'll forgive the second half of that meso credit. So this is the model that we're using to create solidarity economics on the ground in a very real way. The Move Mountains Youth Partnership is the final part of this four-pronged strategy. Shirley has already talked about that. I just want to highlight this photograph here on the right side of the screen is the youngest farmer of our, we recruited 9. One of our farmers couldn't irrigate because of drought conditions on that ditch. But we have 8 remaining farmers, including 2 Mayan farmers from the Alamosa area, Mauricio and Ramiro, who are working with Antonio Garcia on a beautiful bolita bean field and some other crops. But the youngest farmer of the 8 that we have left on 5 different farms, it turns out, rather than 6 is what we had started with, is this young man who's 17 years old, Amayas Mestas, who also has Jicaria Apache ancestry on his grandmother's side of the family. So the local youth are given paid internships. I was told we pay the highest ag wages in Colorado at $15 an hour. They're not ag wages, they're internship stipends for learning how to be farmers. We're also offering them scholarships and other funding for getting certified, for example, in carpenter as an electrician. These are all things that we're trying to do with them. And here they are, the Move Mountain Youth interns. Next year, we're going to increase that internship pay to $17 an hour. We want to stay ahead of the curve, and we want to shame everybody else that's exploiting farmers and farm workers into emulating what we're laying here as sort of the bottom line practice, and that's still not enough. Although here, $17 goes a lot further in a community like ours that is now learning to feed itself again than you would think. That's again Isaiah Sanchez. We have Amado here in Israel, Montoya, Jose Molina back there. I can't tell who that is. Here's one of the young women who's in the project. Jasmine is really skilled at weeding and cultivating. She showed us this morning. She put the boys to shame. She's a leader. She's just an amazing young woman. And so that's part of it too. Are we running out of time? Because I just have a few more slides here. Antonio Garcia's Bolita bean field, Juani's quarter acre, which we're cultivating this morning. And I have 2 more slides, Miguel, and then we're done. And here's the group from last year that helped us harvest corn and make chicos al horno. And one of our scholarship recipients, Alexandria Taylor, who's pursuing nursing studies. And we're currently considering 2 other local youth for scholarships. So finally, some words from our colleague, Adelina Lucero, who couldn't join us because she fell ill. And she's quoting Vida Sotsi Peña, quote, "Our food, our ability to feed ourselves is the foundation of our freedom and sovereignty as land-based peoples." And that pretty much sums up not just Adelina's view, but I think it speaks for Shirley and me as well about how we feel about land, water, environments, and autonomy or sovereignty. That, my dear friends, is our presentation. So.
Thank you so much, Shirley and Devon. Thank you so much. It's amazing. It's something very important and unique in the whole United States, I believe, seriously. It's amazing everything that you have been teaching us. I hope to talk with you soon. And we're going to go into the next one because we're a little behind. But thank you so much, Shirley and Devon.
Thank you.
So there is a way to leave the room, and we're gonna allow immediately to come in the next presentation if it's possible, Peter.
Well, that was